Two Mount Vernon women are dead, killed in a fatal crash on I-64. Illinois State Police report early Thursday morning.
Driving under the influence has claimed yet another life.
Impaired driving is responsible for an average of over 300 deaths a year on Illinois roadways.
Authorities say that driver drove into the median and struck a tree. He is facing charges of driving under the influence and improper lane usage.
Illinois State Police say alcohol did play a factor in that crash.
Drivers can learn more at lifeordeathillinois.com.
Hey, do you love a good story? Great. Then you got to check out the #Storytime podcast. Each episode brings you the craziest, creepiest, and cringiest stories from YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and beyond.
My story is about the time that I was broken up with at the 9/11 memorial. Twice.
Look, the internet is a dumpster full of stories, and I, your host, Will McFadden, dive in headfirst, sift through the flaming trash, and bring you nothing but treasures. Listen to all 21 episodes of #Storytime now on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the FCB Radio Network, home of the best personalities and where real talk lives. Online at fcbradio.com. FCB.
I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't mistake, that we won't mistake. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't mistake, it's gonna be okay. I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't mistake, that we won't mistake. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't mistake, it's gonna be okay.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a mini episode of Just Listen to Yourself with Kira Davis. As you guys know, I like to take these opportunities to highlight other people from around politics and culture. And we have been having a really interesting discussion about woke capitalism. And I had Jeff Webb on this week talking about that. And I think that this next guest kind of blends into that cycle really well. I'm really happy to welcome my colleague, Jim Thompson, to the show. Jim is an editorial cartoonist. He's got a master's in sports and a double minor in politics and culture. And he spent 30 years as a trial lawyer and 35 years as an editorial sports cartoonist. He has done work with the LA Times, Los Angeles Daily News, and he's been a contributor to Sports Illustrated Extra Mustard. And I can't, I'm going to just stop there because this resume is actually very shaming. My resume has like a 4-year background.
Please. Oh, please.
Welcome, Jim, to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm super happy to be here.
Well, I am fascinated by political cartooning because it combines artistry and politics, and I think it's a very specialized discipline because not many people are good in both. You kind of have to be good in both. How did you get into political cartooning? You've got this background as a lawyer, and I didn't really see like art classes or an arts degree. How'd you get into it?
Well, we should probably start with the sports cartooning. I started with the Daily News, like you said, about 30 years ago. And I walked into the editor's office, the sports editor's office, and I pitched it, but that editor just hated it. So he threw me out, literally grabbed me by the shoulder and showed me the door. Fortunately, the next editor loved it. So I did that for 30 years. But political cartoons, I'm kind of new to that. I was doing sports cartoons for a long time before I started doing political cartoons, and Red State gave me that venue.
So when you were with the LA Times, you were doing sports cartoons.
I was.
And tell me a little bit about your experience with the LA Times, because I think my listeners are going to be very interested in this. This is one of the reasons why we actually are blessed enough to have Jim over at Red State with us. And I'm kind of glad that the LA Times is sucky, but you had an experience that sort of was jarring that you didn't expect when you were working over there as a sports cartoonist.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to bag on anybody, but the environment at LA Times became more and more strained. I was only doing sports, but I could tell based on talking to colleagues and editors that it became more and more politicized. and not in a good way. It wasn't like, gee, we like competing opinions. It wasn't that way at all. In fact, it was moving further and further left. And then 2020 hit, and it became even worse. So I was placed in a position where every once in a while I would have a cartoon edited, where I'd show the cartoon to the editors, and they would think, that's a little bit edgy. Maybe the readers wouldn't, necessarily go for that. We don't like hate mail, so how about we do something else? Which is fine, but it became more and more common where my cartoons I'd submit it and get an immediate no. And 2020 was just the beginning of that. Then 2021 happened, brand new editor moved in, and my cartoons were being rejected. And for, I think for silly reasons too. There was one I did on the NFL when it just started, and I was kind of like kidding around about the Madden 2021, and the guy was standing in front of the TV, and he's about ready to play the game, and the game talks back to him and says you have to click the woke box and make sure that you're completely diverse before we can begin the game.
I'm laughing.
yeah, and you don't even have the visual. Frankly, I thought it was a cute cartoon, but it was immediately rejected, and I usually don't ask because generally I can tell if it's too edgy and they're probably not going to want it. They're going to reject it. But I asked, why? Well, it's the first game, and it's probably insensitive or lacking sensitivity to the guys that are kneeling. And of course, my reaction was, are you kidding me? So that was rejected. So then it became pretty typical that if anything was on right of center, or even close to center, it was rejected. So
wow.
And then the new management wanted me to sign a brand new agreement for freelancing, and I looked at it because I'm also a lawyer. I looked at it, and they wanted everything. They were going to own everything, including my firstborn child, and I thought that was quite unreasonable. But in reality, they wanted to keep everything. And I just wasn't willing to do that. And I tried to renegotiate. And frankly, they just went silent. They didn't even respond to me. I said, so what's going on? And I just got radio silence. So I kind of took the clue and I left.
But it's so interesting that their explanation to you was like, well, this might be a little bit too insensitive right now, or might hurt someone's feelings. I mean, is political cartooning not a very insensitive art form? I mean, you can't be worrying about it's almost like being a comedian. You can't be worrying about people's feelings because somebody's feelings are going to be hurt.
Right. And that was my feeling as well. I've when I was with the Daily News, I had a great editor. Frankly, he was way left of center. He knew what my politics were back then, but he also gave me free rein. He would look at a cartoon and not laugh or think it didn't work for him, but he says, I'm going to run it because that's what real editors do. They might not like something, doesn't fit within their own politics, but you're trying to generate thought and appeal and for people to either get mad or laugh, like it, dislike it, but you want readers to look at it. And if it didn't fit within the LA Times, I think left-leaning viewpoint, it was rejected. And it was it was going to be an impossible environment for me to stay. And I probably left a little bit earlier than I was going to, but I wasn't going to stay.
Don't you think we've had this conversation off air on the telephone? And part of me, when I hear stuff like this, forget the politics in it, because I understand, we both understand, we know the landscape, and it really is hard to be an artist and be right of center in any way these days because of the people who are running the places where we work. But if I'm thinking at like a business person, if I'm thinking about like someone who wants to make money, I'm thinking about, okay, I might not necessarily like Jim's cartoons. I might not necessarily agree with the angle he's giving, but LA County, this paper delivers to X, however many millions of people a day see this paper. A large portion of them have to be right of center or Republican or conservative. I would like to sell to them as well. They don't seem really interested in the business aspect of it.
Yeah, that's pretty true. And I also pitched, and I think we had this conversation. I pitched an idea that could make them money. I think I understood the digital environment. The print media is frankly dying, but it just didn't seem like management was interested in expanding that. It was like that they wanted to be woke, but they were living in the 1950s. You know what I mean?
Well, that's what woke is. It's actually regressive, not progressive.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And so anyway, it was just kind of baffling to me. I had a really good editor that was trying to pitch my ideas to make them money, to expand my audience, because I did have a following, and it wasn't just right of center. Most of my cartoons were just on culture and sports, and I didn't go into the Colin Kaepernick right of center ideas. So I thought some of my cartoons were really could have been marketed, they could have put them on mugs and shirts and that kind of stuff. They just weren't interested. So it just became an impossible environment to exist in.
Do you think, Jim, though, that as of late, it's really hard to even talk about sports without politics? I hear you saying, well, a lot of my cartoons were just about sports, but even I'm not even saying that your worldview was infecting every cartoon, but theirs was. And so I think on the left, especially for far left progressives, not necessarily the type of liberal listener that I would have on the show, but far left progressives, if you're not being proactive in pushing that agenda, then that's just as much of a problem as you just making what you feel is a neutral cartoon.
Yeah, and it's I think it's kind of shameful that you can't do anything any longer without injecting sports, and it generally comes from the complaints come from the left. I would do a cartoon and it's like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon removal. It's like within 6 comments, somebody's asking, why didn't you say this about Trump? Like, what are you talking about? It's like, I was doing the Dodgers, right? So it I don't know, it just became kind of ridiculous. Look, I did a couple of cartoons that I thought, if you looked at it and didn't know which side I was on, you would probably assume it was more left-leaning than right-leaning, but I thought it was just more right thinking rather than left, because sometimes people on the right do the wrong thing.
Sure.
More often it's on the left, but that's just me. So I don't know. I think that most readers, if they didn't know who I was, would probably assume that I was right in the middle, because I attacked both sides. And I think that's what a lot of political cartoonists are now avoiding. They don't think that they're able to go in both directions. I mean, we have a target-rich environment right now with the present administration. So,
your cartoons are burning it up over on Red State this week, especially.
Thanks. Yeah,
I think people are. Let's talk a little bit about the history of political cartooning.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, how much you know about it or how much you are interested in it, but the history of political cartooning, it's almost as deep and as rich as just the written word. It is really tradition. And we have this idea that things are so much uglier now and people are so much uglier. But if you go back and you look at political cartoons from like the 1800s and presidential races, then they were scathing. There are some scathing ones, I believe, about Thomas Jefferson out there that even John Adams commissioned.
Yeah, you're right. I don't know that much about political cartooning, as an art. I've never studied it, but the guy named Nash is famous as a cartoonist, and he cartooned on New York politics, and he was frequently attacked. He was chased in the streets. He got death threats because his cartoons were not just edgy, but just really pointed, and some of them were pretty darn ugly. But political cartooning, I think, has had a rich history. It's important. People remember images, no offense to our brilliant writers at Red State, but you can read an article and you'll remember it for, a week or 2 weeks, and then you'd have to go back and look at it. But frankly, people will probably remember a political cartoon for years. Like, did you see that cartoon where, this and this happened? It's just it's how our brains work. It's just, we remember visual. We tend to forget, long 1,000-word articles.
Well, I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's not just a cliche.
Right.
It certainly isn't. Well, how do you come up with your ideas? And how long does it take you to do a cartoon? You draw these things really fast. I feel like in our Red State chat room, you'll pop in and you'll say something funny or pithy, and you'll be like, oh, that'll be a good cartoon. And then like 10 minutes later, there's a cartoon of it. Like, how fast does this guy work?
Yeah, it's kind of like a state secret, but I'll reveal it just to you and the listeners. Yeah, I can do a cartoon depending on complexity. If folks want to go to Red State and look at my stuff, I mean, the simpler ones where there's just a couple of images and maybe a little bit of background, I could probably do that in maybe 10-15 minutes.
Wow.
But the more complicated ones, well, I'll give you a specific example, because Red State readers apparently loved the cartoon that I did yesterday with, it was like a takeoff on Jaws. So you've got Biden in, the orca boat, and it's a tiny little boat, and he's like chumming the waters, and there's a giant shark, and it represents the Taliban. It's like, he has just fed the shark and it's going to eat him. That cartoon probably took me about a half an hour, and it looks more complicated than it is, because, I mean, people say you can't visualize stuff in your head. Well, I do. I actually see the image in my head before I start drawing, and sometimes it changes. I don't like pound on my head and change the image, but I see the image before I start drawing, and usually it's pretty close to what's in my head. So I can sketch it out, and the process goes: I sketch it out, I block off the layers. So let's say there's two people in frame, and then background. So that would be 3 layers, 3 layers of color plus the background. So it's like 7 layers. And yeah, if I'm not distracted by my dog chewing on my knee because he wants to take a walk, I can do
one of those too.
Oh yeah, yeah. That sad look always gets
yes.
me. But a cartoon, a real complicated cartoon will take me an hour. An easier one, less complicated, 10-15 minutes.
2 Mount Vernon women are dead, killed in a fatal crash on I-64. Illinois State Police report early Thursday morning.
Driving under the influence has claimed yet another life.
Impaired driving is responsible for an average of over 300 deaths a year on Illinois roadways.
Authorities say that driver drove into the median and struck a tree. He is facing charges of driving under the influence and improper lane usage.
Illinois State Police say alcohol did play a factor in that crash.
Drivers can learn more at lifeordeathillinois.com.
This episode is sponsored by Now What's Next, a Morgan Stanley podcast that helps make sense of life after the pandemic. Host Sonari Glinton talks with people about how they are rethinking age-old assumptions and finding new opportunities. Now, what's next? There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey y'all, this is Sarah Lee with Marble Halls and Silver Screens, coming to you today to remind you that if you're curious about all the news coming out of the Marble Halls of Washington, D.C., but don't have the patience for the mainstream media's take on it, this podcast is for you. I cover all the news that breaks over the week from D.C. and then attempt to translate it into what it means for a conservative American audience searching for answers amongst the spin. The Silver Screens part of the program covers the overlap between the entertainment industry and politics, which is significant, and then I offer my own thoughts on some of the newest streaming options and films as they're released. So join me on Fridays for a breakdown of what's happening in politics and movies, and be sure to subscribe to Marble Halls and Silver Screens, an FCB radio podcast, at Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and come back soon.
What do you think is happening to political cartooning now? You alluded to it a few comments ago, and you said, I think that print's a dying form. So obviously political cartooning is moving online. And as we know, with our challenges of figuring out how to market your red state, that it's a challenge to adjust to this new way of doing things. But it just seems like one of the treasures of political cartooning is wit and sarcasm and fearlessness, not being afraid to offend the elite, not being afraid to offend. And yet we live in this culture where even our artists, who are supposed to be our rebels, supposed to be our counterculture, are creating art that isn't offensive at all, that doesn't offend anyone. And I wonder how you see that bleeding over into political cartooning, even sports cartooning, just that kind of stuff in general, because I think, unfortunately, as we've talked about, these things are now connected, and your politics in sport is in sports and your sports are in politics.
Yeah, I when I was doing a editorial sports cartoon for the LA Times, I was one of three editorial sports cartoonists in the entire country. So that art form had pretty much dried up, principally because of budget. That's why I left the Daily News. They just didn't have the money to pay me. But moving back to why political cartoonists feel like they can't be funny, like a comedian Seinfeld has said, you can't be a comedian any longer, because the whole point of being funny is you got to offend people. Maybe not, attack them, but comedy is offensive, but it's funny. Mm-hmm. So political cartoonists, I think it kind of goes in waves. So during the Trump administration, all you would see is, negative Republican Trump is an idiot cartoons, and it became, stale. You're telling the same joke over and over again. I get tired of this. Okay, you hate Trump. It's not funny any longer. Okay, come up with something else. Yeah. And talking about our discussions on Red State, frankly, I really appreciated people saying things like, "How did you come up with that idea?" And I don't know. Sometimes I really don't know. But I think for me, it's just being well read. I've read the classics. I still read. I don't read newspapers. I used to, but I read a lot online before I start thinking about I got to do a cartoon and match something in writing to go with it. But it just seems to me, and I could be wrong because I'm certainly leaning right, that cartoonists that are working for newspapers now are almost universally to the left and hard left.
Mhm.
I mean, there are exceptions like Michael Ramirez. I love that guy.
Yes.
Oh
Yeah.
God, you know, yeah, I've got it like a crush on him, and I've always had a crush on him. And I've actually told that to him in an email. He's like, "Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that." But his draftsmanship is just superb. His ideas. Every time he draws a cartoon.
I've had a couple opportunities to dine with him and meet him personally, and he actually lives out my way. And so sometimes, occasionally, we've just run into each other. But I agree with you. I don't even think I appreciated political cartooning until I saw his stuff.
Yeah, I don't think people, because I'm an artist looking at another artist's work, and I can see the type of draftsmanship.
Mm-hmm.
He's just brilliant. He should win a Pulitzer every year, but he'll never win another Pulitzer ever again, because we know the Pulitzer committee now is populated with leftists, so he has zero chance of ever winning again.
And that is the first part of my interview with cartoonist Jim Thompson. He'll be back next week to finish up the interview. I hope you enjoyed hearing from him as much as I did. And don't forget to check out his work over at redstate.com. We'll talk to you next time.
I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't mistake, then we won't mistake. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't mistake, it's gonna be okay. I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't mistake, then we won't mistake. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't mistake, it's gonna be okay.
The FCB Radio Network. First class broadcasting worldwide.
2 Mount Vernon women are dead, killed in a fatal crash on I-64. Illinois State Police report early Thursday morning.
Driving under the influence has claimed yet another life.
Impaired driving is responsible for an average of over 300 deaths a year on Illinois roadways.
Authorities say that driver drove into the median and struck a tree. He is facing charges of driving under the influence and improper lane usage.
Illinois State Police say alcohol did play a factor in that crash.
Drivers can learn more at lifeordeathillinois.com.
This episode is sponsored by Now What's Next, a Morgan Stanley podcast that helps make sense of life after the pandemic. Host Sonari Glinton talks with people about how they are rethinking age-old assumptions and finding new opportunities. Now What's Next?